you think that you lost. Oh, I will take your hand and we'll rise up from the dust. Oh, here we go, 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 let us heal and grow. You won't be alone, we're unstoppable. Don't be afraid to show what we're going for. This is what we know. Here we come back to life, we're still breathing. Standing up, everybody's gonna see it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. Even if we fall, we will rise up and we follow the path that we believe in. No, we're not gonna stop until we reach it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We all have our reasons why we are on this track. Oh, we all have our burdens, yeah, but we just keep on fighting and we never look back. Here we go, 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 let us heal and grow. You won't be alone, we're unstoppable. Don't be afraid to show what we're going for. This is what we know. Here we come back to life, we're still breathing. Standing up, everybody's gonna see it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. Even if we fall, we will rise up and we follow the path that we believe in. No, we're not gonna stop until we reach it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne.
Okay, good evening. It is time for some more Fingerprints of the Gods. So, I'm going to read 3 more chapters tonight. It looks like it's actually going to work out really well if I just stay on 3 chapters a night. So, jump on into, we're on chapter 16, Serpent Sanctuary. So, here we go. From Cholula, we drove east past the prosperous cities of Puebla, Orizaba, and Cordoba, towards Veracruz and the Gulf of Mexico. We crossed the mist-enshrouded peaks of the Sierra Madre Oriental. I don't know if that's where the air was thin and cold, and then descended towards sea level onto tropical plains overgrown with lush plantations of palms and bananas. We were heading into the heartlands of Mexico's oldest and most mysterious civilization, that of the so-called Olmecs, whose name meant rubber people. Dating back to the second millennium BC, the Olmecs had ceased to exist 1,500 years before the rise of the Aztec Empire. The Aztecs, however, had preserved haunting traditions concerning them and were even responsible for naming them after the rubber-producing area of Mexico's Gulf Coast where they were believed to have lived. This area lies between modern Veracruz in the west and Ciudad del Carmen in the east. In it, the Aztecs found a number of ancient ritual objects produced by the Olmecs, and for reasons unknown, they collected these objects and placed them in positions of importance in their own temples. Looking at my map, I could see the blue line of the Coatzacoalcos River running into the Gulf of Mexico more or less at the midpoint of the legendary Olmec homeland. The oil industry proliferates here now where rubber trees once flourished, transforming a tropical paradise into something resembling the lowest circle of Dante's Inferno. Since the oil boom of 1973, the town of Coatzacoalcos, I know I'm butchering that, once easygoing but not very prosperous, had mushroomed into a transport and refining center with air conditioned hotels and a population of 500,000. It lay close to the black heart of an industrial wasteland in which virtually everything of archaeological interest that had escaped the depredations of the Spanish at the time of the conquest had been destroyed by the voracious expansion of the oil business. It was therefore no longer possible, on the basis of hard evidence, to confirm or deny the intriguing suggestion that the legends seem to make, that something of great importance must once have occurred here. Okay, so we have a map, and the caption under it is the Olmec sites of Tres Zapotes, San Lorenzo, and La Venta along the Gulf of Mexico with other Central American archaeological sites. So, it is small. I'm going to have to blow it up here a bit. I'll show you that. Tres Zapotes, San Lorenzo, La Venta, Palenque. Chichen Itza is up here. So this is the Yucatan Peninsula, if you're not familiar. Tikal, I remember. Teotihuacan is up here. Tula. Yeah. I remember studying some of those 20 some plus years ago. I don't remember a whole lot about them now. Okay. I remembered that Coatzacoalcos meant serpent sanctuary. It was here in remote antiquity that Quetzalcoatl and his companions were said to have landed when they first reached Mexico. Arriving from across the sea in vessels, quote, with sides that shone like the scales of serpent skins, end quote, and it was from here, too, that Quetzalcoatl was believed to have sailed on his raft of serpents when he left Central America. Serpent Sanctuary, moreover, was beginning to look like the name for the Olmec homeland, which had included not only Coatzacoalcos, but several other sites in areas less blighted by development. First, at Tres Zapotes, west of Coatzacoalcos, and then at San Lorenzo and La Venta, south and east of it, numerous pieces of characteristically Olmec sculpture had been unearthed. All were monoliths carved out of basalt and similarly durable materials. Some took the form of gigantic heads weighing up to 30 tons. I'm sure we've all seen those, and I bet you there's probably a picture here. Others were massive stelae engraved with encounter scenes apparently involving two distinct races of mankind, neither of them American Indian. Whoever had produced these outstanding works of art had obviously belonged to a refined, well organized, prosperous, and technologically advanced civilization. The problem was that absolutely nothing remained except the works of art, from which anything could be deduced about the character and origins of that civilization. All that seemed clear was that the Olmecs, the archaeologists were happy to accept the Aztec designation, had materialized in Central America around 1500 BC with their sophisticated culture fully evolved. Santiago Tuxtla. We passed the night at the fishing port of Alvarado and continued our journey east the next day. The road we were following wound in and out of fertile hills and valleys, giving us occasional views of the Gulf of Mexico before turning inland. We passed green meadows filled with flame trees and little villages nestled in grassy hollows. Here and there we saw private gardens where hulking pigs grubbed amongst piles of domestic refuse. Then we crested the brow of a hill and looked out across a giant vista of fields and forests bound only by the morning haze and the faint outlines of distant mountains. Some miles farther on, we dropped into a hollow. At its bottom lay the old colonial town of Santiago Tuxtla. The place was a riot of color: garish shop fronts, red tile roofs, yellow straw hats, coconut palms, banana trees, kids in bright clothes. Several of the shops and cafes were playing music from loudspeakers. In the Zocalo, the main square, the air was thick with humidity and the fluttering wings and songs of bright-eyed tropical birds. A leafy little park occupied the center of this square, and in the center of the park, like some magic talisman, stood an enormous gray boulder, almost 10 feet tall, carved in the shape of a helmeted African head. Full-lipped and strong-nosed, its eyes serenely closed, and its lower jaw resting squarely on the ground, this head had a somber and patient gravity. Here, then, was the first mystery of the Olmecs, a monumental piece of sculpture more than 2,000 years old, which portrayed a subject with unmistakable Negroid features. There was, of course, There were, of course, no African blacks in the New World 2,000 years ago, nor did any arrive until the slave trade began well after the conquest. There is, however, firm paleoanthropological evidence that one of the many different migrations into the Americas during the last ice age did consist of peoples of Negroid stock. This migration occurred around 15,000 BC. Known as the Kobata head after the estate on which it was found, the huge monolith in the Zocalo was the largest of 16 similar Olmec sculptures so far excavated in Mexico. It was thought to have been carved not long before the time of Christ and weighed more than 30 tons. Tres Zapatos, Zapotes. From Santiago Tuxtla, we drove 25 kilometers southwest through wild and lush countryside to Tres Zapotes, a substantial late Olmec center believed to have flourished between 500 BC and AD 100. Now reduced to a series of mounds scattered across maize fields, the site had been extensively excavated in 1939 and 40 by the American archaeologist Matthew Stirling. Historical dogmatists of that period, I remembered, had held tenaciously, to the view that the civilization of the Mayas was the oldest in Central America. One could be precise about this, they argued, because the Mayan dot and bar calendrical system, which had recently been decoded, made possible accurate dating of huge numbers of ceremonial inscriptions. The earliest dates ever found on a Mayan site corresponded to AD 228 of the Christian calendar. It therefore came as quite a jolt to the academic status quo when Stirling unearthed a stela at Tres Zapotes, which bore an earlier date. Written in the familiar bar and dot calendrical code used by the Maya, it corresponded to 3 September 32 BC. What was shocking about this was that Tres Zapotes was not a Maya site, not in any way at all. It was entirely, exclusively, unambiguously Olmec. This suggested that the Olmecs, not the Maya, must have been the inventors of the calendar, and that the Olmecs, not the Maya, ought to be recognized as the mother culture, quote unquote, of Central America. Despite determined opposition from gangs of furious Mayanists, the truth which Stirling Spade had unearthed at Tres Zapotes gradually came out. The Olmecs were much, much older than the Maya. They'd been a smart, civilized, technologically advanced people, and they did indeed appear to have invented the bar and dot system of calendrical notation, with the enigmatic starting date of 13 August 3114 BC, which predicted the end of the world in AD 2012. And as a quick side note, if you believe in the the theory that somewhere along the line they added 100 years in there, so we skipped a century. People talk about the lost century. Then that means that it actually ends not in 2012 but 2112 or thereabouts. Anyway, lying close to the calendar stela at Tres Zapotes, Sterling also unearthed a giant head. I sat in front of the head now, dated to around 100 BC. It was approximately 6 feet high, 18 feet in circumference, and weighed over 10 tons. Like its counterpart in Santiago Tuxtla, it was unmistakably the head of an African man wearing a close-fitting helmet with long chin straps. The lobes of the ears were pierced by plugs. The pronounced negroid features were furrowed by deep frown lines on either side of the nose, and the entire face was concentrated forwards above thick, down-curving lips. The eyes were open and watchful, almond-shaped and cold. Beneath the curious helmet, the heavy brows appeared beetling and angry. Sterling was amazed by this discovery and reported, quote, "The head was a head only, carved from a single massive block of basalt, and it rested on a prepared foundation of unworked slabs of stone. Cleared of the surrounding earth, it presented an awe-inspiring spectacle. Despite its great size, the workmanship is delicate and sure, the proportions perfect. Unique in character among Aboriginal American sculptures, it is remarkable for its realistic treatment. The features are bold and amazingly negroid in character." End quote. Soon afterwards, the American archaeologist made a second unsettling discovery at Tres Zapotes: children's toys in the form of little wheeled dogs. These cute artifacts conflicted head-on with prevailing archaeological opinion, which held that the wheel had remained undiscovered in Central America until the time of the conquest. The dogmobiles proved, at the very least, that the principle of the wheel had been known to the Olmecs, Central America's earliest civilization, and if a people as resourceful as the Olmecs had worked out the principle of the wheel, it seemed highly unlikely that they would have used it just for children's toys. And that is actually the end of that first chapter. And as another side note, I read word for word what's in the book. So if the word negroid bothers you, don't listen to my streams because I'm going to read exactly what the author wrote. I'm not going to censor it. Chapter 17, The Olmec Enigma. After Tres Zapotes, our next stop was San Lorenzo, an Olmec site lying southwest of Coatzacoalcos in the heart of the Serpent Sanctuary, the legends of Quetzalcoatl made reference to. It was at San Lorenzo that the earliest carbon dates for an Olmec site around 1500 BC had been recorded by archaeologists. However, Olmec culture appeared to have been fully evolved by that epoch, and there was no evidence that the evolution had taken place in the vicinity of San Lorenzo. In this there lay a mystery. The Olmecs, after all, had built a significant civilization which had carried out prodigious engineering works and had developed the capacity to carve and manipulate vast blocks of stone. Several of the huge monolithic heads, weighing 20 tons or more, had been moved as far as 60 miles overland after being quarried in the Tuxtla Mountains. So where, if not at ancient San Lorenzo, had their technological expertise and sophisticated organization been experimented with, evolved, and refined? Strangely, despite the best efforts of the archaeologists, not a single solitary sign of anything that could be described as the developmental phase of Olmec society had been unearthed anywhere in Mexico, or for that matter, anywhere in the New World. These people, whose characteristic form of artistic expression was the carving of huge negroid heads, appeared to have come from nowhere. That is interesting. I have never heard anybody mention carvings that closely resemble those anywhere in the world, actually. If if they have found them, I haven't heard about it. San Lorenzo We reached San Lorenzo late in the afternoon. Here at the dawn of history in Central America, the Olmecs had heaped up an artificial mound more than 100 feet high as part of an immense structure some 4,000 feet in length and 2,000 feet in width. We climbed the dominant mound, now heavily overgrown with thick tropical vegetation, and from the summit we could see for miles across the surrounding countryside. A great many lesser mounds were also visible, and around about were several of the deep trenches the archaeologist Michael Coe had dug when he had excavated the site in 1966. Coe's team made a number of finds here, which included more than 20 artificial reservoirs, linked by a highly sophisticated network of basalt-lined troughs. Part of this system was built into a ridge. When it was rediscovered, water still gushed forth from it during heavy rains, as it had done for more than 3,000 years. The main line of the drainage ran from east to west into it, linked by joints made to an advanced design. 3 subsidiary lines were channeled. After surveying the site thoroughly, the archaeologists admitted that they could not understand the purpose of this elaborate system of sluices and waterworks. Nor were they able to come up with an explanation for another enigma. This was the deliberate burial along specific alignments of 5 of the massive pieces of sculpture showing Negroid features, now widely identified as Olmec heads. These peculiar and apparently ritualistic graves also yielded more than 60 precious objects and artifacts, including beautiful instruments made of jade and exquisitely carved statuettes. Some of the statuettes had been systematically mutilated before burial. The way the San Lorenzo sculptures had been interred made it extremely difficult to fix their true age, even though fragments of charcoal were found in the same strata as some of the buried objects. Unlike the sculptures, these charcoal pieces could be carbon dated. They were and produced readings in the range of 1200 BC. This did not mean, however, that the sculptures had been carved in 1200 BC. They could have been, but they could have originated in a period hundreds or even thousands of years earlier than that. It was by no means impossible that these great works of art, with their intrinsic beauty and an indefinable numinous power, could have been preserved and venerated by many different cultures before being buried at San Lorenzo. The charcoal associated with them proved only that the sculptures were at least as old as 1200 BC. It did not set any upper limit on their antiquity. La Venta. We left San Lorenzo as the sun was going down, heading for the city of Villahermosa, more than 150 kilometers to the east in the province of Tabasco. To get there, we rejoined the main road running from Acayucan to Villahermosa and bypassed the port of Coatzacoalcos in a zone of oil refineries, towering pylons and ultra-modern suspension bridges. The change of pace between the sleepy rural backwater where San Lorenzo is located and the pockmarked industrial landscape around Coatzacoalcos was almost shocking. Moreover, the only reason that the time-worn outlines of the Olmec site could still be seen in San Lorenzo was that oil had not yet been found there. It had, however, been found at La Venta, to the eternal loss of archaeology. We were now passing La Venta. Due north off a slip road from the freeway, this sodium-lit petroleum city glowed in the dark like a vision of nuclear disaster. Since the 1940s, it had been extensively developed, quote unquote, by the oil industry. An airstrip now bisected the site where a most unusual pyramid had once stood, and flaring smokestacks darkened the sky which Olmec stargazers must once have searched for the rising of the planets. Lamentably, The bulldozers of the developers had flattened virtually everything of interest before proper excavations could be conducted, with the result that many of the ancient structures had not been explored at all. We will never know what they could have said about the people who built and used them. Matthew Stirling, who excavated Tres Zapotes, carried out the bulk of the archaeological work done at La Venta before progress and oil money erased it. Carbon dating suggested that the Olmecs had established themselves here between 1500 and 1100 BC and had continued to occupy the site, which consisted of an island lying in marshes to the east of the Tonala River, until about 400 BC. Then construction was suddenly abandoned. All existing buildings were ceremonially defaced or demolished, and several huge stone heads and other smaller pieces of sculpture were ritually buried in peculiar graves, just as had happened at San Lorenzo. The La Venta graves were elaborate and carefully prepared, lined with thousands of tiny blue tiles and filled up with layers of multicolored clay. At one spot, some 15,000 cubic feet of earth had been dug out of the ground to make a deep pit. Its floor had been carefully covered with serpentine blocks and all the earth put back. 3 mosaic pavements were also found, intentionally buried beneath several alternating layers of clay and adobe. La Venta's principal pyramid stood at the southern end of the site, roughly circular at ground level. It took the form of a fluted cone, the rounded sides consisting of 10 vertical ridges, with gullies between. The pyramid was 100 feet tall, almost 200 feet in diameter, and had an overall mass in the region of 300,000 cubic feet, an impressive monument by any standards. The remainder of the site stretched for almost half a kilometer along an axis that pointed precisely 8 degrees west of north. Centered on this axis, with every structure in flawless alignment, were several smaller pyramids and plazas, platforms and mounds, covering a total area of more than 3 square miles. There was something detached and odd about La Venta, a sense that its original function had not been properly understood. Archaeologists referred to it as a ceremonial center, and very probably that is what it was. If one were honest, however, one would admit that it could also have been several other things. The truth is that nothing is known about the social organization, ceremonies, and belief systems of the Olmecs. We do not know what language they spoke or what traditions they passed to their children. We don't even know what ethnic group they belonged to. The exceptionally humid conditions of the Gulf of Mexico mean that not a single Olmec skeleton has survived. In reality, despite the names we have given them and the views we've formed about them, these people are completely obscure to us. It is even possible that the enigmatic sculptures they left behind, which we presume depicted them, were not their work at all, but the work of a far earlier and forgotten people. Not for the first time, I found myself wondering whether some of the great heads, other remarkable artifacts attributed to the old wait a minute. Let me start that sentence again. Not for the first time, I found myself wondering whether some of the great heads, other remarkable artifacts attributed to the Olmecs, might not have been handed down like heirlooms, perhaps over many millennia, to the cultures which eventually began to build the mounds and pyramids at San Lorenzo and La Venta. Okay, so we have a picture here. Reconstruction of La Venta. Note the unusual fluted cone pyramid that dominates the site. So I'll bring that up. So yeah, the fluted earth pyramid, and then this other pyramid directly facing it. It would have been very interesting to see some of these sites in use. But without a time machine, we'll never see that. Okay, if so, Then who are we speaking of when we use the label Olmec? The mound builders, or the powerful and imposing men with negroid features who provided the models for the monolithic heads? Fortunately, some 50 pieces of Olmec, quote unquote, Olmec, monumental sculpture, including 3 of the giant heads, were rescued from La Venta by Carlos Pellicer Camara, a local poet and historian who intervened forcefully when he discovered that oil drilling by the Pemex company jeopardized the ruins. By determined lobbying of the politicians of Tabasco, within which La Venta lies, he arranged to have the significant finds moved to a park on the outskirts of the regional capital, Villahermosa. Taken together, these finds constitute a precious and irreplaceable cultural record, or rather a whole library of cultural records left behind by a vanished civilization, but nobody knows how to read the language of these records. Okay, so we have 2 pictures. Um, I think they'll come up as 2 pictures. Uh, Profile view of the head of the Great Sphinx at Giza. Profile view of Olmec head from La Venta, Mexico. Oh, and then we've got a bunch more pictures, but I'll start with those 2. So yeah, okay, so this is the profile of the Sphinx. Okay, nice detail on the ear. Okay, so that's that one. And then we have a profile of the Olmec head from La Venta. Right there. Interesting. Okay. And then front view of the head of the Sphinx, of the Sphinx. How did I get, of the Sphinx? Sorry, trying to combine my words there. So front view of the Sphinx head. Front view of the Olmec head. A lot more detail in certain areas on each of them. Okay, and then the next one. This has got a much longer um, caption. It says Sphinx-like Olmec sculpture from San Lorenzo, Mexico. Is it possible that the many similarities between the cultures of pre-Columbian Central America and ancient Egypt could have stemmed from an as yet unidentified third-party civilization that influenced both widely separated regions at a remote and early date? Okay, so here we go with the Sphinx-like head here, or sculpture. So I guess I see kind of where they're coming from on the Sphinx-like, where it's got this headdress out here that does look somewhat similar to the Egyptian one on the Sphinx. All right. And still more pictures. There are 2 more. Double puma statue at Uxmal, Mexico. Which is going to be hard to really get any detail out of because it's so small. I'm having to really blow it up a lot here. But here it is in the center bottom of the picture. Can't really get much out of that. And then below that, we have another very long caption for this picture. Double lion symbolism from ancient Egypt depicting the Akeru lion gods of yesterday and today. Akeru Ekeru was written in hieroglyphs as a thing that looks kind of like the sculpture I just showed you in the other picture. The religions of both regions share many other common images and ideas. Also noteworthy is the fact that Pa'achi, the Central American word for human sacrifice, means literally to open the mouth, which calls to mind a strange ancient Egyptian funerary ritual known as the opening of the mouth. Likewise, it was believed in both regions that the souls of dead kings were reborn as stars. Okay, so then here is that picture. And then we actually get back to some reading. So, and this is the one where it said that the symbol resembles this. And then it's in text where it shows the symbol, but the symbol is very similar to the outline of this statue. Anyway, so so Deus Ex Machina, Villahermosa, Tabasco Province. I was looking at an elaborate relief that had been dubbed Man in Serpent by the archaeologists who found it at La Venta. According to expert opinion, it showed, quote, an Olmec wearing a headdress and holding an incense bag enveloped by a feathered serpent, end quote. I don't know why I couldn't say that word. I think my brain couldn't decide between two pronunciations. The relief was carved into a slab of solid granite measuring about 4 feet wide by 5 feet high, and showed a man sitting with his legs stretched out in front of him as though he were reaching for pedals with his feet. He held a small bucket-shaped object in his right hand. With his left, he appeared to be raising or lowering a lever. The headdress he wore was an odd and complicated garment. To my eye, it seemed more functional than ceremonial, although I could not imagine what its function might have been. On it, or perhaps on a console above it, were 2 X-shaped crosses. I turned my attention to the other principal element of the sculpture, the feathered serpent. On one level, it did indeed depict exactly that, a plumed or feathered serpent, the age-old symbol of Quetzalcoatl, whom the Olmecs therefore must have worshipped or at the very least recognized. Scholars do not dispute this interpretation. It is generally accepted that Quetzalcoatl's cult was immensely ancient, originating in prehistoric times in Central America, and thereafter receiving the devotion of many cultures during the historic period. The feathered serpent in this particular sculpture, however, had certain characteristics that set it apart. It seemed to be more than just a religious symbol. Indeed, there was something rigid and structured about it that made it look almost like a piece of machinery. Whispers of Ancient Secrets. Later that day, I took shelter in the giant shadow cast by one of the Olmec heads Carlos Pellicer Camara had rescued from La Venta. It was the head of an old man with a broad, flat nose and thick lips. The lips were slightly parted, exposing strong, square teeth. The expression on the face suggested an ancient, patient wisdom, and the eyes seemed to gaze unafraid into eternity, like those of the great Sphinx at Giza in Lower Egypt. It would probably be impossible, I thought, for a sculptor to invent all the different combined characteristics of an authentic racial type. The portrayal of an authentic combination of racial characteristics therefore implied strongly that a human model had been used. I walked around the great head a couple of times. It was 22 feet in circumference, weighing 19.8 tons, stood almost 8 feet high, and had been carved out of solid basalt, and displayed clearly, quote, an authentic combination of racial characteristics, end quote. Indeed, like the other pieces I had seen at Santiago Tuxtla and Tres Zapotes, it unmistakably and unambiguously showed a Negro. The reader can form his or her own opinion after examining the relevant photographs in this book. My own view is that the Olmec heads present us with physiologically accurate images of real individuals of Negroid stock, charismatic and powerful African men whose presence in Central America 3,000 years ago has not yet been explained by scholars, nor is there any certainty that the heads were actually carved in that epoch. Carbon dating of fragments of charcoal found in the same pits tell us only the age of the charcoal. Calculating the true antiquity of the heads themselves is a much more complex matter. It was with such thoughts that I continued my slow walk among the strange and wonderful monuments of La Venta. They whispered of ancient secrets, the secret of the man in the machine, the secret of the Negro heads, and, last but not least, the secret of a legend brought to life, for it seemed that flesh might indeed have been put on the mythical bones of Quetzalcoatl when I found that several of the La Venta sculptures contained realistic likenesses not only of Negroes, but of tall, thin-featured, long-nosed, apparently Caucasian men with straight hair and full beards wearing flowing robes. And that is the end of chapter 17. So we're going to do one more tonight, and we'll call it, and we'll go raid somebody. So, this chapter, chapter 18, is Conspicuous Strangers. Matthew Sterling, the American archaeologist who excavated La Venta in the 1940s, made a number of spectacular discoveries there. The most spectacular of all was the stele of the bearded man. The plan of the ancient Olmec site, as I have said, lay along an axis pointing 8 degrees west of north. At the southern end of this axis, 100 feet tall, loomed the fluted cone of the Great Pyramid. Next to it, at ground level, was what looked like a curb, about a foot high, enclosing a spacious rectangular area 1/4 the size of an average city block. When the archaeologists began to uncover this curb, they found, to their surprise, that it consisted of the upper parts of a wall of columns. Further excavation through the undisturbed layers of stratification that had accumulated revealed that the columns were 10 feet tall. There were more than 600 of them, and they had been set together so closely that they formed a near impregnable stockade. Hewn out of solid basalt and transported to La Venta from quarries more than 60 miles distant, the columns weighed approximately 2 tons each. Why all this trouble? What had the stockade been built to contain? Even before excavation began, the tip of a massive chunk of rock had been visible jutting out of the ground in the center of the enclosed area, about 4 feet higher than the illusory curb, and leaning steeply forward. It was covered with carvings. These extended down out of sight beneath the layers of soil that filled the ancient stockade to a height of about 9 feet. Sterling and his team worked for 2 days to free the great rock. When exposed, it proved to be an imposing stele 14 feet high, 7 feet wide, and almost 3 feet thick. The carvings showed an encounter between 2 tall men, both dressed in elaborate robes and wearing elegant shoes with turned-up toes. Either erosion or deliberate mutilation, quite commonly practiced on Olmec monuments, had resulted in the complete defacement of one of the figures. The other was intact. It so obviously depicted a Caucasian male with a high-bridged nose and a long flowing beard that the bemused archaeologist promptly christened it Uncle Sam. Just a thought here, where one was defaced and the other wasn't. I think they've theorized, anyway, that went on in Egypt sometimes, where certain depictions would be defaced because from dynasty to dynasty, different gods were worshipped, and so, or somebody would be have a beef with one pharaoh, so they would deface the depictions of that pharaoh in later dynasties, stuff like that. Anyway, just a thought. I walked slowly around the 20-ton stele, remembering as I did so that it had lain buried in the earth for more than 3,000 years. Only in the brief half century or so since Stirling's excavations had it seen the light of day again. What would its fate be now? Would it stand here for another 30 centuries as an object of awe and splendor for future generations to gawp at and revere? Or in such a great expanse of time was it possible that circumstances might change so much that it would once again be buried and concealed? Perhaps neither would happen. I remembered the ancient calendrical system of Central America, which the Olmecs had initiated. According to them and their more famous successors, the Mayas, there just weren't any great expanses of time left, let alone 3 millennia. The fifth sun was all used up, and a tremendous earthquake was building to destroy humanity 2 days before Christmas in AD 2012, or 2112, like I was saying earlier. I turned my attention back to the stele. Two things seemed to be clear. The encounter scene it portrayed must, for some reason, have been of immense importance to the Olmecs, hence the grandeur of the stele itself, and the construction of the remarkable stockade of columns built to contain it. And as was the case of the Negro heads, it was obvious that the face of the bearded Caucasian man could only have been sculpted from a human model. The racial verisimilitude was too good for an artist to have invented it. The same went for two other Caucasian figures I was able to identify among the surviving monuments from La Venta. One was carved in low relief on a heavy and roughly circular slab of stone about 3 feet in diameter, dressed in what looked like tight-fitting leggings. His features were those of an Anglo-Saxon. He had a full, pointed beard and wore a curious floppy cap on his head. In his hand he extended a flag, or perhaps a weapon of some kind. His right hand, which he had held across the middle of his chest, appeared to be empty. Around his slim waist was laid a flamboyant sash. The other Caucasian figure, this time carved on the side of a narrow pillar, was similarly bearded and attired. Who were these conspicuous strangers? What were they doing in Central America? When did they come? And what relationship did they have with those other strangers who had settled in this steamy rubber jungle? The ones who had provided the models for the great Negro heads. Some radical researchers who rejected the dogma concerning the isolation of the New World prior to 1492 had proposed what looked like a viable solution to the problem. The bearded, thin-featured individuals could have been Phoenicians from the Mediterranean who had sailed through the Pillars of Hercules and across the Atlantic Ocean as early as the 2nd millennium BC. Advocates of this theory went on to suggest that the Negroes shown at the same sites were the slaves of the Phoenicians, picked up on the coast of West Africa prior to the transatlantic run. The more consideration I give to the strange character of the La Venta sculptures, the more dissatisfied I become with these ideas. Probably the Phoenicians and other Old World peoples had crossed the Atlantic ages before Columbus. There was compelling evidence for that, although it is outside the scope of this book. The problem was that the Phoenicians, who had left unmistakable examples of their distinctive handiwork in many parts of the ancient world, had not done so at the Olmec sites in Central America. Neither the Negro heads nor the reliefs portraying bearded Caucasian men showed any signs of anything remotely Phoenician in their style, handiwork, or character. Indeed, from a stylistic point of view, these powerful works of art seem to belong to no known culture, tradition, or genre. They seem to be without antecedents either in the New World or in the Old. They seemed rootless, and that, of course, was impossible because all forms of artistic expression have roots somewhere. Hypothetical third party. It occurred to me that one plausible explanation might lie in a variant of the hypothetical third party, quote unquote, theory originally put forward by a number of leading Egyptologists to explain one of the great puzzles of Egyptian history and chronology. The archaeological evidence suggested that rather than developing slowly and painfully, as is normal with human societies, the civilization of ancient Egypt, like that of the Olmecs, emerged all at once and fully formed. Indeed, the period of transition from primitive to advanced society appears to have been so short that it makes no kind of historical sense. Technological skills that should have taken hundreds or even thousands of years to evolve were brought into use almost overnight and with no apparent antecedents whatever. For example, remains from the pre-dynastic period through 3500 BC show no trace of writing. Soon after that date, quite suddenly and inexplicably, the hieroglyphs, familiar from so many of the ruins of ancient Egypt, begin to appear in a complete and perfect state. Far from being mere pictures of objects or actions, this written language was complex and structured at the outset, with signs that represented sounds only, and a detailed system of numerical symbols. Even the very earliest hieroglyphs were stylized and conventionalized, and it is clear that an advanced cursive script was was it I think it's a typo, was in common usage by the dawn of the first dynasty. What is remarkable is that there are no traces of evolution from simple to sophisticated, and the same is true of mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and architecture, and of Egypt's amazingly rich and convoluted religio-mythological system. Even the central content of such refined works as the Book of the Dead existed right at the start of the dynastic period. The majority of Egyptologists will not consider the implications of Egypt's early sophistication. These implications are startling, according to a number of more daring thinkers. John Anthony West, an expert on the early dynastic period, asks, quote, "How does a complex civilization spring full-blown into being? Look at a 1905 automobile and compare it to a modern one. There is no mistaking the process of development, but in Egypt there are no parallels. Everything is right there at the start." The answer to the mystery is, of course, obvious, but because it is repellent to the prevailing cast of modern thinking, it is seldom considered. Egyptian civilization was not a development, it was a legacy. End quote. West has been a thorn in the flesh of the Egyptological establishment for many years, but other more mainstream figures have also confessed puzzlement at the suddenness with which Egyptian civilization appeared. Walter Emery, late Edwards Professor of Egyptology at the University of London, summed up the problem. Quote, "At a period approximately 3,400 years before Christ, a great change took place in Egypt, and the country passed rapidly from a state of Neolithic culture with a complex tribal character to one of well-organized monarchy. At the same time, the art of writing appears, monumental architecture, and the arts and crafts develop to an astonishing degree, and all the evidence points to the existence of a luxurious civilization. All this was achieved within a comparatively short period of time, for there appears to be little or no background to these fundamental developments in writing and architecture." End quote. One explanation could simply be that Egypt received its sudden and decisive cultural boost from some other known civilization of the ancient world. Sumer on the lower Euphrates in Mesopotamia is the most likely contender. Despite many basic differences, a variety of shared building techniques and architectural styles does suggest a link between the two regions, but none of these similarities is strong enough to infer that the connection could have been in any way casual. With one society directly influencing the other. On the contrary, as Professor Emery writes, quote, "The impression we get is of an indirect connection, and perhaps the existence of a third party whose influence spread to both the Euphrates and the Nile. Modern scholars have tended to ignore the possibility of immigration to both regions from some hypothetical and as yet undiscovered area. However, a third party whose cultural achievements were passed on independently to Egypt and Mesopotamia would best explain the common features and fundamental differences between the two civilizations." End quote. Among other things, this theory sheds light on the mysterious fact that the Egyptians and Sumerian people of Mesopotamia appear to have worshipped virtually identical lunar deities who were among the oldest in their respective pantheons. Thoth, or Toth, I think people have sometimes said. I'm going to say Thoth because that's how it's spelled. In the case of the Egyptians, Sin in the case of the Sumerians. According to the eminent Egyptologist Sir E. A. Wallace Budge, quote, "The similarity between the two gods is too close to be accidental. It would be wrong to say that the Egyptians borrowed from the Sumerians or the Sumerians from the Egyptians, but it may be submitted that the literati of both peoples borrowed their theological systems from some common but exceedingly ancient source." End quote. The question, therefore, is this: what was that, quote, "common but exceedingly ancient source," end quote, that, quote, "hypothetically and as yet undiscovered area," end quote, that advanced third party to which both Budge and Emery refer? And if it left a legacy of high culture in Egypt and in Mesopotamia, why shouldn't it have done so in Central America? It's not good enough to argue that civilization, quote, "took off much later in Mexico than it had in the Middle East." I don't see the end quote on that. He starts it off as a quote and then he doesn't close it. So, it's not good enough to argue that civilization took off much later in Mexico than it had in the Middle East. It is possible that the initial impulse could have been felt at the same time in both places, but that the subsequent outcome could have been completely different. On this scenario, the civilizers would have succeeded brilliantly in Egypt and in Sumer, creating lasting and remarkable cultures there. In Mexico, on the other hand, as also seems to have been the case in Peru, they suffered some serious setback, perhaps getting off to a good start when the gigantic stone heads and reliefs of bearded men were made, but going rapidly downhill. The light of civilization would never quite have been lost, but perhaps things didn't pick up again until around 1500 BC, the so-called Olmec horizon. By then, the great sculptures would have been hoary with age, ancient relics of immense spiritual power, their all but forgotten origins wrapped in myths of giants and bearded civilizers. If so, we may be gazing at faces from a much more remote past than we imagine when we stare into the almond eyes of one of the Negro heads or into the angular, chiseled Caucasian features of Uncle Sam. It is by no means impossible that these great works preserve the images of people from a vanished civilization which embraced several different ethnic groups. That, in a nutshell, is the hypothetical third party theory as applied to Central America. The civilization of ancient Mexico did not emerge without external influence, and it did not emerge as a result of influence from the Old World. Instead, certain cultures in the Old World and in the New World may both have received a legacy of influence and ideas from a third party at some exceedingly remote date. Villahermosa at Oaxaca. Before leaving Villahermosa, I visited CICOM, CICOM, the Center for Investigation of the Cultures of the Olmecs and Maya. I wanted to find out from the scholars there whether there were any other significant Olmec sites in the region. To my surprise, they suggested that I should look farther afield, at Monte Alban in Oaxaca province, hundreds of kilometers to the southwest. Archaeologists had apparently unearthed Olmecoid artifacts and a number of reliefs thought to represent the Olmecs themselves. Santha and I intended to drive straight on from Villahermosa into the Yucatan Peninsula, which lay northeast. The journey to Monte Alban would involve a huge detour, but we decided to make it, in the hope that it might shed further light on the Olmecs. Besides, it promised to be a spectacular drive over immense mountains and into the heart of the hidden valley where the city of Oaxaca lies. We drove almost due west past the lost site of La Venta, past Coatzacoalcos once again, and on past Sayula and Loma Bonita to the road junction known as Tuxtepec. In so doing, by degrees we left behind countryside scarred and blackened by the oil industry, crossed long, gentle hillsides carpeted in lush green grass, and ran between fields ripe with crops. At Tuxtepec, where the Sierras really began, we turned sharply south, following Highway 175 to Oaxaca. On the map, it looked barely half the distance that we had driven from Villahermosa. The road, however, proved to be a complicated, nerve-wracking, muscle-wrenching, apparently endless zigzag of hairpin bends. Narrow, winding, and precipitous, which went up into the clouds like a stairway to heaven. It took us through many different layers of alpine vegetation, each occupying a specialized climatological niche, until it brought us out above the clouds in a place where familiar plants flourished in giant forms, like John Wyndham's triffids, creating a surreal and alien landscape. It took 12 hours to drive the 700 kilometers from Villahermosa to Oaxaca. By the time the journey was over, my hands were blistered from gripping the steering wheel too tight for too long around too many hairpin bends. My eyes were blurred, and I kept having mental retrospectives of the vertiginous chasms we had skirted on Highway 175 in the mountains where the triffids grew. The city of Oaxaca is famous for magic mushrooms, marijuana, and D.H. Lawrence, who wrote and set part of his novel, The Plumed Serpent, here in the 1920s. There is still a bohemian feel about the place, and until late at night a current of excitement seems to ripple among the crowds filling its bars and cafes, narrow cobbled streets, old buildings, and spacious plazas. We checked into a room overlooking one of the 3 open courtyards in the Hotel Las Golondrinas. The bed was comfortable, there were starry skies overhead, but tired as I was, I couldn't sleep. What kept me awake was the idea of the civilizers, the bearded gods and their companions. In Mexico, as in Peru, they seemed to have confronted failure. That was what the legends implied, and not only legends, as I discovered when we reached Monte Alban the next morning. And that is the end of that 3rd chapter, chapter 18, so we will pick up with chapter 19 next time. Adventures in the Underworld, Journeys to the Stars. All right. Let's see who's still around. It looks like, Mr. Blitzer's playing Days Gone, which is a great game, by the way. So let's go on over there. I will take us there, and I'll see you there in just a minute.
Shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes, wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not my talk. Not lights like I had, but more sophisticated into love.